Thank you again for everybody for being here, for staying. I want to start by pointing out that Karl Rove just gave me $20. So the next 5 minutes will be a paid political commentary about Karl Rove. The next panel is Lessons Learned from the 2016 Presidential Election, and we've got a nice panel of people that have covered it and analyzed it. The moderator today is Andrea Mitchell, Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent for NBC News and the host of Andrea Mitchell Reports. Few people know as much about Washington as Ms. Mitchell. She's covered several presidential elections, 7 presidential administrations, Capitol Hill, the State Department, and intelligence agencies. The panelists are Jonathan Martin, national political correspondent for the New York Times and a political analyst for CNN. He's covered politics for Politico, the national journals, The Hotline, and the National Review. Timothy Alberta, chief political correspondent for Politico magazine, covering the presidency, Capitol Hill, partisan politics, democratic change, and the evolving role of money in election. He covered the 2016 presidential election campaign for the National Review. Mike Nelson, the former professor of political science at Rhodes College and a senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, has written several books about the U.S. presidency, including the recent Trump's First Year. And Bob Stein, a fellow at the Baker Institute and the Lena Goldman Fox Professor of Political Science at Rice University. An expert on voting behavior, he assisted the Commission on Federal Election Reform, co-chaired by President Jimmy Carter and Secretary James Baker. Andrea.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, and I have to just say what a great treat it is for me to be here for this special inaugural series of seminars on the election. First of all, anything I learned about politics, I learned from James A. Baker III, whom we all like to think of as the statesman that he is, the great Treasury Secretary that he was, the great White House Chief of Staff. But when I first met him, he was a campaign manager, and the best ever, someone who understood politics because he understood the American electorate, he understood people's hopes and dreams and our constitutional process. And so he was always aspiring to elect people, but in the best way possible. So it's a great treat for me to be here under his auspices and to have spent a little bit of time with him, and then to be with this great panel. First of all, this election, you've just heard from 2 of the best political analysts anywhere, 2 people who have had more experience in running campaigns. But in covering campaigns and in analyzing campaigns academically, I've got a great panel here to talk about 2016. 2016, the strangest election I've ever covered, and now we're living with the strangest White House experience I've ever had, with having covered 2 terms of Ronald Reagan and some of Jimmy Carter's presidency and all of the presidents, whether I was on the Hill or at the State Department, ever since Bill Clinton's campaign and his White House during the first term. But nothing has prepared us for a president who uses Twitter the way he uses Twitter, for the turmoil and turnover in this administration, and for the shortening of the news cycle that David Axelrod spoke about. It's also the 5th time that we had a president elected who did not win the popular vote. And the outcome was certainly the biggest surprise since Dewey beats Truman in 1948. So, Jonathan, as someone who was covering this campaign for the New York Times, how would you rank it in your experience, and why? Why was it so unique?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a treat to be here and get out of the cold in D.C. for a couple of days and be with all of you. It's remarkable that in nearly April of 2018, we're still talking about the 2016 election, but for good reason, because as Andrea said,
First of all, the president and the losing candidate are still talking and writing about the 2016 election.
Exactly. So if they are, we sure can too. But look, I think for good reason. This is going to be written about and debated for decades and perhaps centuries to come about what happened. I mean, I think to me what was so remarkable about it, just going back to the primaries, is I I think our expectations of what matters and what is relevant in politics are increasingly outdated. We in the press corps and our sources who work in politics, we get so caught up in a set of metrics. So-and-so hired a great staffer, and no offense to Karl Rove or David Axelrod, but we get so consumed with who's being hired. So-and-so raised X amount of dollars for this quarter, so-and-so has a great new TV ad. That's the kind of grist that we get so consumed with in political journalism. And I think what was so striking about this campaign, and perhaps offered a corrective to that kind of coverage, is that those kinds of things don't matter a whole lot anymore. They just are being far more outweighed by a flatter political world in which not only do the parties not matter as much anymore, but individuals act as empowered actors in their own right, political actors, and they make decisions oftentimes that have nothing to do with who's being endorsed by who, how much money so-and-so raised, what kind of campaign operation they have. I mean, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump demonstrated that those kind of traditional metrics just don't have the same impact anymore, that people aren't interested in that, and they're going to vote based upon who's speaking to them, and who's speaking to them through entirely different ways now. And so that, to me, was the most important lesson from this crazy campaign is I think it's important for us to now cover politics differently and look at politics, especially at this level, differently going forward.
Tim, I want you to weigh in on those last 2 weeks, or as a great Texas colleague of mine, Mark Murray, our deputy political director, wrote, we posted this back in August on the 12 days that stunned the nation. And the 12 days really, for me, it started being on the road covering Hillary Clinton. It started with the reopening of the email investigation. And I'm wondering what you were seeing at Politico as well.
Yeah, well, and to echo Jonathan, thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here. I happen to be spending about 6 days with Mike Pence's campaign down the home stretch, and I was actually on that fateful flight that skidded off the runway at LaGuardia and put a good scare into everyone, and the Secret Service leapt out of their seats and encircled Mike Pence, and he had to sort of tell them everything was okay, and then the FDNY came into the back of the plane and evacuated us, and it was quite an experience. And that would have been my most memorable moment from spending that time with the Pence campaign. And I interviewed him at length and wrote a pretty tough piece that they didn't love about sort of the bunker mentality he had adopted. But all of that said, the LaGuardia incident paled in dramatic emphasis to the moment when we were all on the plane and the news broke that the Comey investigation had been reopened. And I had spent the last 3 or 4 nights with the Pence folks, traveling different parts of the country, up late in the hotel bars, picking their brains, looking at some of their numbers, having some off-the-record conversations. And I can tell you with complete candor that not a single person involved with the Mike Pence operation, not named Michael Richard Pence, believed that they were going to win that election. And then when that news broke on the campaign bus that day, the mood shifted on a dime. And the same folks, including some of the now vice president's most loyal lieutenants who had been good sources of mine, I'm sure good sources of Jonathan's, many other folks who had been, I think it's not overstating it to say that they were beginning in that phase of the campaign to even spin Mike Pence 2020 and talking to reporters about how good he was going to look coming out of all of this, and that he was one of the only major players in 2016 who was not going to have egg on their face. And the conversations instantly shifted from that and from the expectation that Trump would lose, and perhaps lose in historic fashion, to, oh my goodness, do we actually have a chance now? Is this is this what we needed? Is this the proverbial October surprise? So I'll never forget that experience of being on that bus and seeing the Pence folks sort of frantically hair on fire. And then when we got to the event and they were bringing some of the reporters off of the bus back to the press holding area, we caught a quick glimpse of Pence huddling with some of his senior-most folks, and you could just see it written all over their faces. And we learned later that day that Pence had just gotten off the phone with President Trump, now President Trump, and it was really a surreal moment to see the incredible emotional and tactical shift in real time as those folks absorbed that news.
And just to follow up, Mike, when we look at those last couple of weeks, nothing can change what had preceded it, which was, the email controversy, self-inflicted wounds, bad campaign, not being able to get free media because of the Trump primetime rallies. We can talk about all of that, which preceded it. But the bottom line was, at that point, even with a badly run campaign and not a natural candidate, they were most likely ahead. Not only according to the polls, which we now don't trust as much as we used to, but according to just the feel and what the internal polls. We know 2 days before the election, in fact, that Trump officials were making the network rounds and saying, we only have a 20% chance of winning. There's a lot of rethinking about that now. But during those 2 weeks, there was a change in a key number of voters in suburban white women, college-educated women. According to my own reporting and according to some of our analysis, and I don't know if you agree with this, people knew it was a change election, and she had campaigned that Donald Trump was too risky to have his finger on the nuclear button to elect. Suddenly, with that reopening of the email controversy, she became risky, and it resurrected a lot of feelings about her that a large number of voters had. Now, attack that and agree or disagree and take it apart if you don't mind.
That's a great question, to which I think not only do I not have a good answer, but I'm not sure there is a good answer, because we just don't know what else would have changed if Comey had not, in July, chastised but not indicted Hillary Clinton, and then in October reopened the investigation, and then closed it again a few days. We just don't know what would have happened if his book will be out soon. Nobody knows anything about the book, but I'll tell you this: he will be the hero of his own story. So we'll. But I'd say this, let's assume, for the sake of discussion, let's assume that had that last minute intervention not taken place, Hillary Clinton would have been elected. She would have been narrowly elected, which would not undo the fact that Donald Trump had already done something astonishing, and that is that he had won the Republican against a really strong Republican field that was full of successful swing state and big state governors and up-and-coming senators. And having won the nomination, even if he had lost, he would have come close. And what this tells me is that when you really stand back and look at where we've been headed in American politics since World War II, there's a sense in which Donald Trump is really the culmination of trends that have been underway for a while. Think about that. We come out of the Great Depression, we come out of World War II, into the Cold War. The country is placing an enormous value in choosing its presidents on people who have experience in government, and in particular, experience in Washington. And then in the mid to late 1960s and on into the 1970s, we have Vietnam and Watergate and a kind of growing revulsion against Washington, but not against experience in government. So starting in 76 with Jimmy Carter, and then Ronald Reagan, and then Bill Clinton, and then George W. Bush, we're electing people whose experience in government is in the states, but kind of moving away from what had started out as experience in doing the job in the city where the job is located. And you might argue that the next iteration of this trend, revulsion against Washington, followed by revulsion against government, period, is somebody like Donald Trump coming along and basically making a virtue out of his inexperience. You know, I can remember him saying, of course politicians can be bought. You know, I give money to candidates, and when I need them a couple years later, they're there. Or saying, do you really want somebody to be your president? And that's the highest paying job they've ever had. Talking about paying for his own campaign, which, you know, I think from a good government standpoint is you know, a turnoff. But to many voters, it was like, yeah, this guy can't be bought. He's already rich, so we can trust him. And all that followed from that, I think, that got Trump that close to the White House, as it turned out, into the White House. But even if he had stopped close to the finish line, we would have learned something that has been underway in American politics for a long time, and of which he will not be the last manifestation. I mean, think of the Democrats' field, which includes a lot of the traditional folks, but there's Mark Zuckerberg talking about it, and Oprah talking about it, and Tom Steyer talking about it, Mark Cuban. I mean, the idea of people coming from outside the political world, period. Trump has opened that door, but it's a door that's been kind of ready to be opened now for a few years.
Let me just validate that from data from Peter Hart and his focus groups. I was talking yesterday to someone in preparation for today with one of our colleagues who had been to all 7 of Peter Hart's focus groups during the last weeks and months of the campaign. And there was not a single person questioned about Hillary Clinton's message, who understood what her message was. But they all liked the fact that he was an outsider, that experience hasn't worked for us so far, let's try someone who doesn't have experience. I mean, that was all, and these are, you know, a mixture of people, Republicans, Democrats, independents. So Peter Hart being one of the really experienced people at running these focus groups, that's pretty impressive data to me, anecdotally, at least. Bob Stein, one of the things we did in covering Hillary Clinton, we kept complaining that during the final weeks, during the general election after the conventions, we were spending all this time in what they said was important early voter states, Florida and North Carolina, for instance, and never going to Michigan. And focusing, yes, on Pennsylvania, but I can give you some experiences that I had there, which contradicted their claim that they were really doing Pennsylvania. But we didn't go to Michigan outside of Detroit and Flint until the Friday and the Monday before the election, when they were scrambling already. When they had flattened, I think because of Comey, they had stalled and they knew they were getting in trouble. You're an expert on early voting and different kinds of new applications for voting. Tell me about the reliance on early voting by the Clinton campaign, maybe to its detriment in terms of not going to other battleground states.
Well, let me answer that 2 ways, and go back to your first question to Michael. I think we missed something in the polling and in the expectation of what happened. Elections in this last few decades are not about persuasion. People don't change from a Clinton to a Trump voter in the last weeks because somebody found a laptop with salacious information. Elections are often about simply getting your base out and its mobilization. And here are some facts. I had the privilege of polling for another university, unfortunately, during the presidential election in Texas, a state that nobody thought was in play. And we might remember that Hillary Clinton did better than any presidential candidate since Jimmy Carter. She held the Republican victory to less than 9 points, and counties like Harris and Dallas went heavily Democratic. What I did was I polled people who were likely voters. Now, what do I mean by likely voters? I actually looked at people within 30 days of the election who were registered. Can't vote unless you're registered, unless you're from North Dakota. Moreover, I had people who told me they were very likely to vote. Here's what's interesting. Democrats were far more likely to vote than likely registered two-star voters who were Republican until the last 2 to 3 weeks. I got Jim Granado, my colleague at U of H, to let me poll again. Mark Franklin in Wisconsin, who was certain that there was a double-digit lead in Wisconsin. I asked Corey Land, if he's here today, about that, and everything changed. And what happened, I think, is very simple. One of the things that I look at is not who you're voting for, is who you think is going to win the election. Who do you think is going to win the election in Texas, in Harris County, or in Dallas? People then tell you who they talk to. They talk to people like themselves. What changed very dramatically was that Republicans in Texas began to believe in the last 2 weeks that Donald Trump could win. They started coming out. Now you say, how do you know they came out? I didn't trust people to tell me they're going to vote. People lie, particularly people who vote. They over-report. So what I did was I actually had registered voters. I knew their names, I knew their addresses, and yes, it's a matter of public record to prevent voter fraud, whether or not they voted. And what do I find? I found Republicans who shouldn't have voted showing up and voting in Texas. I found the same thing in Wisconsin. In the exit polls, voters were asked not only when they made their decision for president, months, if not years ago, but when they made their decision to vote. In Wisconsin, Republican voters were more likely to make their decision in the last 10 days about voting. So I guess what I'm saying here is, don't look at persuasion, don't look at the idea that he was an outsider. It was that period of the last 2 weeks when people began to believe correctly, not only could Trump possibly win this, but that they ought to come out and vote. As to the early voting, I can tell you a couple of things that will probably somewhat surprise you, and I can elaborate. Turns out our wonderful state of Texas adopted in-person early voting in 1989, 1990. And I'm sure Karl Rove knows this because I've had students work in his campaigns. It actually depresses voter turnout. In the early years, jurisdictions that had early voting depressed it, mostly because it increased the cost of conducting GOTV, get out the vote. If you had 12 days to get out the vote and you had a fixed budget, what did you end up doing? You went from 3-star to 4-star voters. But then again, what happened was candidates began to realize it's an arms war, and you're going to have to raise more money. And in later states, as they adopted in Colorado and other states that came on with early voting, they spent more money. It turns out that the reforms of early voting were adopted very heavily in the Obama 2008 and 2012 elections. They knew they could harvest their vote at a lower cost per vote by going into these key states, many of which were battleground states like Colorado. The interesting question is, does it make any difference in turnout? No pun intended. The turnout effects of early voting have been negligible. The big turnout effects are things like vote by mail. And that's even more interesting, because if you ask somebody, did you vote? You'd say, well, of course I voted. I went to the polls. And as we heard this morning, I think voting is more than going to the polls. It's actually voting for all the races on the ballot. Vote by mail, Colorado, Oregon, and of course Washington, have higher completion rates. People vote the whole ballot, and dramatically increasing, 15, 16%. They'll vote for 8 or 9 more races in a vote by mail because they sit at home, get on the phone, do what everybody else would do, ask their friends. So there are effects on vote by mail. And in Colorado, one of the big things was take the vote by mail, go down to the University of Colorado in Boulder, and have everybody come down to a beer house. Up on the screen is how you fill out your ballot, and people did it. So I think what you heard this morning, the most consequential, is the way we vote. 30% to 33% don't vote in person on election day. Wow. That number is going to rise and rise dramatically. One of the consequences is going to be people may not vote as much, but when they do, they'll vote more completely.
Jonathan,
Yeah.
I'm still trying to figure out from your reporting. Yeah, we're all trying to figure out what happened. What happened was she didn't go to Wisconsin. She didn't really go to Michigan. Yeah. And from my experience in Pennsylvania, where I first was covering politics, and very much wanted to take the bus trip out of the convention this year, even though I wasn't assigned to it initially because we had been working. We'd done the Cleveland convention, then flown to Florida for the rollout of Tim Kaine as her vice presidential running mate, then to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia for the convention. So nobody had had any sleep for 2 weeks or longer. And so I wanted to do the bus trip leaving Friday because it was through Pennsylvania and it was replicating in some part my favorite campaign, 1992, when the bus trips, Clinton, Gore, just was the most fun retail, spontaneous, not getting on an airplane, seeing America from a bus and watching Bill Clinton in the middle of the night get up and give a speech to 10 people at a crossroads. Whether or not it was a planned speech, sometimes it was just a bar closing. But it was the most extraordinary campaign that I've ever experienced. And so we leave Philadelphia after a rally at Temple University and go to Harrisburg, go to Johnstown, go to Pittsburgh, small rallies. You could have flown, never stopping, never meeting people. You had the sense she wasn't really campaigning in Pennsylvania. So for all the time she spent in Pennsylvania, she wasn't getting any kind of payoff with the suburban voters that she needed.
I think there were two major deficiencies in the end of the Clinton campaign. One is what you were just mentioning, and what I think is now sort of like widely seen in hindsight as a fatal mistake, and that is you never go to Wisconsin, and obviously Wisconsin went into the Republican column. That's glaring. Michigan, you sort of panic at the last minute and you go to Detroit and Grand Rapids, and you have Obama go into Ann Arbor to get college kids fired up, but you don't have Obama go into Detroit. And then, Pennsylvania, I think the critique, as you pointed out, was that she didn't spend enough time in parts of the state that were not Allegheny County, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, that she was not in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, she was not in Johnstown, she was not in Altoona. So I think that's a valid critique, and I think there's something to that. If you talk to the Clinton folks, they certainly regret not putting her in those places earlier on. I think there's a sort of larger issue, though, when it comes to her messaging that I think was problematic, and that is, she went to Grand Rapids, Michigan at the end of the campaign. What in the world was a Democratic candidate doing in Western Michigan, which, as Carl knows, is full of the most conservative, Dutch reform, evangelical voters in the world? Well, she was there to say Donald Trump's a bad man, and he's immoral, and he is not a good role model for this country. And her hope at that point was to persuade whatever folks were, uneasy about Trump to either stay home or to come out and pull the lever for a Democrat. And that was part of a broader tactic that you saw in our TV ads. The TV ads were not saying Donald Trump is going to, hurt the poor or is bad for the middle class. They were saying he's an immoral man and someone who's risky to the country. Her messaging was aimed at suburbanites and even Republican voters and trying to bring them over instead of trying to sort of run more of a populist campaign against Trump. It was a more sort of tactical message of he's a bad guy, A, and B, he's risky. For a lot of folks who are struggling, they didn't really care that he was a bad guy, and they didn't think he was that much more risky than the last 40 years of politicians because they weren't doing that well. And so I think that was a mistake to do that kind of a campaign, try to target high-income suburbanites at the expense of more downscale traditional Democratic voters. And what happened with the Comey letter is that all those suburbanites who she was trying to convince that Trump was too risky, Andrea, as you said, who didn't like Trump, they said, oh my gosh, well, Hillary's in real trouble here too. She could perhaps have legal issues. I don't like Trump's tweets and his profanity, and he's kind of a little bit not my speed, but I think I'm going to go back to the Republican Party. And that's the real untold story of the campaign, I think. It's not just that Hillary dropped the ball on a populist message and lost the Obama voters in the Rust Belt. It's that she invested so much in suburban Republicans who couldn't stomach Trump. And after Comey, all those folks went back to their party and said, I'm going to just grudgingly pull the lever for Trump. She didn't lose the election necessarily among blue-collar voters. That hurt. She also lost it because in upscale suburban places around the Rust Belt, those folks decided to pull the lever for a Republican after months and months and months of not wanting to do so.
You jump in, Mike.
I was going to say that if, as I think almost every study has shown for years now, if there is among voters a declining level of trust in government and in the people who serve in government, then I think any politician who can come across to voters as being authentic is already two steps down a three-step road, because that seems to be now a quality that people don't expect to see in candidates. With Donald Trump, and this is part of the reason why the news networks covered so many of his speeches live, you never knew what this guy was going to say, because he probably didn't know what he was going to say until he said it. But the one thing you did know was he wasn't reading a speech or delivering a rehearsed speech, which is the exact opposite of what people are used to seeing and what they saw with all his Republican opponents and with Hillary Clinton, and which, just by virtue of the fact that people were giving written speeches or rehearsed speeches, That was discounted. That's not their words. That's what they're trying to sell us. That's the sales pitch. With Trump, David Axelrod was absolutely right, the cable news. But then Twitter. I mean, one thing people don't doubt when they see Donald Trump's tweets is that this guy wrote his own tweets, right? This isn't being staffed out and massaged before it goes out. Yeah. So to the extent, I mean, this may tell us, this may be a sad commentary on where we are, that we settle for anything that seems authentic, regardless of everything else you might want to have in a president of the United States. But I think that is where we are. And Trump, without guile, without a strategy behind it, just being who he is, and not knowing, for example, that when an Access Hollywood tape comes out, you're supposed to go to ground or even withdraw. No, some of us were at that debate that took place right afterward in Washington University, St. Louis, where the buzz around the media tent and the buzz around camp, will he even show up? Will he drop out? He shows up with 4 Bill Clinton accusers, brings them out before the press, seats them in the debate hall, and when Hillary attacks him for his outrageous statements on that tape, he doesn't say, well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. He says, I just talk about it. That guy does it. And he's pointing at Bill Clinton, and she enables it. Yes. And he points at Hillary. That's something that it's in nobody's playbook. Mm-hmm. But this guy didn't know enough to realize that, and it turned out to be exactly the strategy or the tactic at least, that worked in getting him close.
Well, let's talk about that Access Hollywood tape, because it was October 7th, and a half hour after that tape dropped, WikiLeaks drops the John Podesta emails. WikiLeaks, which had been putting out emails only in the morning up until then, but this was after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And immediately, there's a lot of distraction because you've got all these John Podesta emails. It was 10 years of John Podesta emails. Tim and anyone else, why is it that Access Hollywood was not disqualifying to a candidate who was supported by evangelicals to any candidate? Or how is it possible that that did not have an impact? And, we can link it to, in your brain, to what we're witnessing right now. How is it possible? Because we don't know what the impact of this current phase is going to be.
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question. I would unpack it, I guess, starting here. When Donald Trump had become the de facto Republican nominee and had sealed the deal after the Indiana primary in early May, he held a meeting with upwards of 600 or 700 evangelical leaders in New York City, and I was there. And what was so fascinating about his meeting with a lot of these folks, many of whom had publicly spoken about their reluctance to support him, was that there was no testimony. There was no stories of, childhood church Sundays with his mother and father. There was a shared sense of grievance and an attempt on the part of Trump to channel this idea that conservatives, and especially social conservatives and evangelical Christians, had been trampled upon by big government, by the American left, by pop culture, by the Obama administration for 8 years. And that he would do what none of them had the gumption to do, which was to stand up and punch back. And it's difficult to quantify just how appealing that message was, I think, for evangelical Christians who felt as though they, not even in the George W. Bush administration, which was famously populated by and informed by a number of folks who were born-again Christians, not even then did they feel like they had someone who would be such a forceful advocate. And to return just briefly to this idea of the Rust Belt, Andrea, if I can, what's so interesting is to place all of this in the broader context of the Republican Party and its 10 or 15 year history. Stepping back for a moment, when we think about the 2012 presidential election and Mitt Romney winning 27% of Hispanic voters, 17% of non-white voters nationally, and the directive from on high, we all remember the autopsy commission from the Republican National Committee, and the message moving forward was very clear that our path to the White House, if we are to win back the presidency, is to reclaim these states that demographically have begun to drift away from us, and that is the Virginias, the Nevadas, the New Mexicos, the Colorados, especially areas in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Sun Belt. And what was so interesting is that Mitt Romney won 206 electoral votes in 2012. He was 64 shy of the presidency. And if you talk to all of the Republican wise men heading into the 2016 nominating season and talk to them about the various scenarios for how you get back to 270, the one scenario you never heard from any of these folks was Pennsylvania 20, Ohio 18, Michigan 16, and Wisconsin 10. That is 64 electoral votes, right? If you could have that inside straight through the Rust Belt, you win back the presidency. And yet, Donald Trump and his folks were the only people I ever heard make that argument. And of course, they were dismissed by some folks within their own campaign. They were dismissed by rival campaigns. They were certainly dismissed by his future chief of staff, Reince Priebus, and folks at the RNC. And I really feel as though, I feel this way today, I'll feel this way 50 years from now, that the watershed moment of the entire campaign for me, more than Comey or more than anything else, at least as far as informing how we should view this race, was March 8th, 2016, when not only did Donald Trump clean the floor in the Michigan primary with the Republican field, but Bernie Sanders, who had been trailing by more than 20 points in a number of respected public opinion polls heading into Michigan, won that primary. And what was so fascinating is that there were two things in particular in the exit polls. First, in both the Republican and in the Democratic primaries, the plurality of voters were non-college educated whites.
Right.
And Donald Trump cleaned up among that group on the Republican side, and Bernie Sanders cleaned up among that group on the Democratic side. And then also on the question of, has free trade done more to help or hurt the economy? In both the Republican and the Democratic primary, clear majorities of both Republicans and Democrats said that it had done more to hurt them than to help them. And sure enough, same thing, Trump and Sanders both cleaned up. And the next morning, I actually wrote a piece saying Trump and Sanders' Michigan victories shows how Trump could redraw the electoral map, and just looking at how maybe it's far-fetched, but there is something here. There is an inside straight here. And I think what is so important to recognize, even with that established, and some of us may be awakening to that reality after the Michigan primary, in mid-October of 2016, just a couple of weeks before the general election, Donald Trump was polling at 31% in Michigan, right? We can have all of these conversations about how the pollsters screwed it up and how they got it wrong and how we didn't see this coming. But a Detroit News-sanctioned, very respected poll in Michigan 2.5 weeks before Election Day had Donald Trump at 31%. And it wasn't an outlier. His average in the Real Clear Politics aggregate was 33. So you ask any panel of intelligent political scientists and journalists and academics and campaign veterans whether somebody can win a battleground state when they're at 31% 2.5 weeks before Election Day, and they're going to tell you no. So I can't necessarily put an enormous amount of blame on the Clinton folks for not realizing until it was too late that they were in danger, because every quantifiable metric of that race told them that they weren't.
Except for the fact that they had lost to Bernie Sanders in Michigan. It was a real warning sign. They were being told by people I know in Michigan, you've got to get here, and they're spending time going to Arizona. And any way you look at it, Michigan and Pennsylvania are keys for any Democrat to win, and Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. Bob Stein, the polling has been attacked, ours as well as everybody else's. If you look at our national poll, we had a 4-point race on Election Day, or the last poll we took, with a 3-point margin of error, and that is where the popular vote went. Of course, we weren't doing state polls. We were relying on the Marquette poll, which turned out to be way off in Wisconsin, and other state polls. So, of course, we have to re-examine everything about the way we deal with this. But what's the point of national polls in the closing weeks of
I mean, obviously,
kind of campaign?
when the Electoral College is determined, in 50 states and battleground states, but a couple of things, and again, I recommend the Association of Public Opinion Research team that looked at this. The national polls were correct. In fact, one of the ironies, of course, is that when you do a poll like this, you try to get the people who are likely to vote. Knowing how people are going to vote is not as difficult as knowing whether they're going to vote. That's the hard question. Most of us make our vote choices about the age of 12 or 13 when we acquire our partisanship. And if tribalism is so intense, then that partisanship becomes more than just an echo chamber. It determines, my best anecdote about persuasion and not persuading was when Bill Clinton was caught with Monica Lewinsky, and I called my mother one night and I said, "This is terrible. How do you feel about Bill Clinton?" She says, "I would have slept with him." She was 82 at the time. Rest her soul. My point being, my mother, I said, "What if I slept with one of my students?" "I kill you." My point, Democrat and Republicans, yeah, my mother said that. She's not around to, I think it's simply a case of, as I said before, one, the best polls I saw, and again in the APOR report it's clear, interviewing a panel, looking at the same people over time. I will disagree on the argument that people were persuaded. People were not persuaded in this election. There are a large number of statewide polls, including the one I worked on in Texas, where we didn't see people moving from one candidate to another. There weren't these Republican suburban people who would decide, well, maybe I'll vote for Trump, maybe I won't. They were more undecided about voting.
Yeah, that's fair.
And that's what brought them in. They always knew who they were going to vote for. The only real question is, did they get mobilized late? So I think to a large extent, when you look at the polls, with the point that I think was made this morning at a panel, that we have difficulty reaching certain populations and getting really good representative samples, the problem basically was this was a late deciding election, not for how you were going to vote, but whether you were going to vote. And the polls picked up on that. I'll argue again, the Marquette poll, which I still think is one of the finest polls done, I think Mark Franklin is a superb pollster, and after he asked him, "Why did you stop polling?" he said, "Well, Marquette didn't have the money, and two, we were in double-digit margins." When he looked at the same exit polls in his own state, he could see what was happening. People who he would not have interviewed because they were not likely to vote were moving into the electorate. One thing that's worth considering, what happens when you vote 2, 3, 4 weeks before the election and start seeing these stories about Comey and a laptop? You've already cast your ballot. What does it really fundamentally mean to vote in Colorado, Oregon, and Washington when you get your ballot 3 and 4 weeks before the election and then miss events such as the type we had? I think that might be a little bit more disconcerting in the sense that we try to make voting more convenient. It's not altogether clear that the convenience has led to a higher rate of turnout. It doesn't even convince me that anybody has made better decisions, but that convenience tells you that lots of people will miss things in an election that might have made a difference in their vote choice.
I mean, one thing that we don't know, and it's, was it Comey? Was it that she didn't campaign in as many battleground states? When we looked at the data, he went to 130 plus battleground state events after the conventions. She went to 80. Some of that downtime was the pneumonia. Right around that debate, but she did not go to as many events. But the other thing we don't know about, which we can never disprove, maybe the investigation will, is the role in social media of bots on all sides. Some suggesting, the Comet Pizza thing was the famous one, but we saw what this underground campaign was doing now in terms of people's preferences, their prejudices, their likes and their dislikes. And Jonathan, I don't know how we get to the bottom of this. How do you cover a campaign if we knew that there was Russian meddling. Right. The intelligence community said so on October 7th. We didn't know what that meant. We certainly didn't know it meant putting out false Black Lives Matters, right. Information in communities that would really resent that, or pro-Hillary Clinton information, or anti-Donald Trump information in other communities which were pro-Trump.
Yeah, it's harder now than ever for us to cover campaigns because we don't necessarily know where information is coming from. It's more of a kind of Wild West type environment now where the internet is so unregulated, and increasingly people are getting their news and information from their social media feeds. And this is tough. Like, if you work for the New York Times, you like to think, yeah, we catch flack from some folks because we're supposedly, if you're on the right, we're too liberal, and if you're on the left, we're too corporatist. But look, I think people generally agree that it's a fantastic news organization that does quality work. The challenge we have is that a lot of folks are now getting their news by scrolling on their Facebook feeds and clicking a story that looks interesting. And you know what? They don't look to see what the news organization is, let alone the byline of the story, like we want to think that they actually do. I mean, all they're looking at is just, that sounds interesting, click, and it could be the Daily Bugler that's coming from St. Petersburg, or it could be the New York Times, but they don't make that difference. I think the onus increasingly is going to be on news consumers to differentiate, what is real and what is fake. And that's a hell of a burden to put on people who don't necessarily follow this stuff like all of us do. They're casual voters, they're casual followers of news and events. And it's daunting. It's daunting.
Well, the other aspect of this is the primetime live rallies and Trump's entertainment value.
Yes.
I don't know if any of you want to speak to that.
Yeah.
Tim, jump in, because policy speeches did not get as much coverage. This was a very different kind of campaign. This was not the kind of campaign where news organizations were, for the most part, doing stories on, here is the housing policy or the education policy of this candidate or the other candidate. It was a live, rolling experience, and he was doing it every night in prime
theater,
time on live television.
Yeah.
And the phoning into Sunday shows, the total and dominating free media saturation was just something that I don't think anyone, certainly in the media, and anyone on a rival campaign had ever grappled with, and were obviously caught unaware. And I think also, piggybacking on Jonathan's point as far as media, for me, one of the real fundamentals of the race that is not talked about much is the extent to which distrust of the media among conservatives had been building for decades and decades and decades, and that Trump, rather than sort of inventing this war on the fake news, was able to exploit these conditions that had been building.
He's riding the wave. Yeah.
Riding the wave. And does anybody remember?
The irony being that nobody in the entire field on either side, and probably nobody in modern political history, cares more about the media than Trump himself.
Or benefited more from
benefited more from, and he's the guy bashing the media the most when he cares the most about the approval of the media. There's a bit of irony to that.
And I think, and even thinking back to the 2012 campaign, you remember when Newt Gingrich was just having this terrible stretch heading out of New Hampshire, and he had gotten clobbered in Iowa and New Hampshire, and he was on the ropes. And what did he do in the two debates in South Carolina?
South Carolina?
Every response on the debate stage in South Carolina, Newt Gingrich turned it into an indictment of the media. And Mitt Romney's internal tracking polls showed that Gingrich's favorables and unfavorables flipped overnight after the second South Carolina debate, when he spent about 8 minutes going after CNN's John King. And there were lessons learned from that. And aside just from the media being a very valuable punching bag and a useful punching bag for Republicans, to your point a second ago, Andrea, about how we try to sift through information as consumers of news and as producers of news, I think one of the unintended consequences, with enormous implications for the electoral process, of this conservative distrust of the media is that unwittingly, people on the right who have agitated against the media, and oftentimes with due cause. I understand some of their complaints. I'm not here to vilify them. But I think the unintended consequence is that they have unwittingly driven many conservative voters into the arms of sources of information that are far less reliable than the mainstream media. When you have people who would come up to us at a campaign rally and say, well, I don't trust Politico, I don't trust the New York Times, I don't trust CNN or the Washington Post, but they're simultaneously getting their information from the Gateway Pundit or from Breitbart News, that's a hell of a problem, right? In the pursuit of purging unreliable news, you are in fact replacing it with information that is significantly less reliable, to put it generously.
Let me raise a question, and this may not be the perfect panel to raise this question, but what about being the first woman candidate, the first woman nominee of a major party, and whether the rules were different, are different? Jen Palmieri has just come out with the book, Dear Madam President, which is really a reflection on women's roles in society, not a campaign book per se. It's a small book, but it's very interesting. I had a conversation with her yesterday on the air about it, because it talks about preparing Hillary Clinton, her advisors, and herself, all her life, to campaign like a man. Now, we know she didn't do, the phone call in the middle of the night, and as she did against Barack Obama, to try to get people used to the idea that a woman could be commander-in-chief. But I will not cry, I will not show weakness. And he got into her head, I think, with weak Hillary, all those nicknames, because importantly, toward the end of the campaign, before the last debate, when in September, the weekend before 9/11, when she was diagnosed with pneumonia, she didn't tell anyone, including her staff, except one or two people on the staff, one in particular. And so she powered her way the next day through a fundraiser that was planned at Cipriani in New York, where she did Basket of Deplorables. Now, would she have done that if she weren't, running a fever and walking around with pneumonia? I don't know. But then she, because Sunday was 9/11, went out in the heat of Sunday and appeared as the former senator from New York and nearly collapsed. And if she were not so concerned about being the woman and him calling her weak, would she have said, time out, I have pneumonia, I'm down for a couple of days? No one really thought that she didn't work hard, really, given her track record over the years as Secretary of State and all. So if her health hadn't become an issue that he had imposed upon her by Twitter and Rally, because she then was exposing herself, and it was only after she collapsed that someone in the campaign van said, no, don't put out that statement about her having dehydration because of the pneumonia, and the rest of them said, what pneumonia? And that tells you something also about the secrecy and the refusal to be open about herself. But is that something that women are more affected with as candidates? Mike, as an academic, maybe you can take a look back at women who've run for high office. And
we're all sitting here in terror that us guys are going to say something that...
Yeah, you can take that one for sure.
So, well, let me say this.
I'm leaving.
When President George Bush passed out and vomited on the lap of the Japanese Prime Minister, that hurt. When Jimmy Carter, I think, one time sort of collapsed when he was out running, that hurt. So I think for anybody who presents himself as the leader of the free world, or wants to be the leader of the free world, a visible display of weakness is going to create a problem for them. Let me get into it deeper here and say I think it's significant that that a woman was the runner-up for the Democratic nomination in 2008 and was the nominee of the Democratic Party in 2016 and almost won, and that there are now 23 senators who are women. When you mentioned 1992, Andrea, until that election occurred, there were 2 women in the Senate. And if you look at the ranks in state government of secretaries of state, and lieutenant governors, and state attorney generals, I think it's really, we are on the crest of electing our first woman president, because we're getting more and more used to seeing women in positions of authority. But once you're in that position of authority, then people are going to react to you the same way they reacted to President Carter and President Bush and candidate Clinton when she had her collapse there on 9/11. Weakness is kind of a scary thing when you think about being president of the United States.
I mean, I'll be candid. There's no question that there are voters who were uneasy with her because of her gender. I don't think that's even a question that's up for debate. That's the reality of the nature of the country's politics. But I think is less clear is how much of her challenge was just her gender versus the fact that she was Hillary Clinton of the Clintons, and that folks had long-standing unease, shall we say, with the Clinton brand in American politics. We'll never know the answer to that question. Although I will say, I think 2020 could be revealing if Democrats nominate a female and she goes on to beat President Trump. That might indicate it was more about the Clinton factor than anything else.
And on both of those points, just quickly, the interesting thing is that as we do see more and more women running for office, I think pollsters and political scientists have observed over the recent years how what was once the most telling statistic that they would look at in internal surveys and in exit polling, which was the gender gap, has actually given way to the diploma divide, which is to say that if you are just looking at generic individuals who you are targeting, you can probably learn more about their voting preference and which way that they would be inclined to lean, again, just generically speaking, based on whether or not they went to college versus whether they are a man or a woman. And the Cruz campaign found that out the hard way with Trump after Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa, they were almost identical among non-college educated folks. New Hampshire was such a blowout for Trump that they couldn't draw any conclusions, but in every primary and caucus thereafter, they were figuring out, the Cruz campaign had built out this unbelievably sophisticated universe, and they had 500 indicators they're looking at, from what kind of beer you drink to what kind of car you drive, all these different things, but they were starting to realize after a little while that almost any one of those factors was overwhelmed by the very simple question of, did this person go to college? And if the answer was no, then Trump was extraordinarily more likely to win their vote.
It's interesting that Cambridge Analytica had been working for Cruz before they started working for Trump. That's the way they were doing that kind of data mining, I suspect. But for women to win, don't they have to win a majority of the female vote? And Clinton won the majority of the female vote, but that's because of African American women and other minority women. She didn't win the white female vote.
That's correct.
Okay. It's worth noting that, again, I hate to beat a horse on mobilization, but take 3 cities, Detroit, take Philadelphia, and take Milwaukee. Double-digit lower turnouts in 2012, not just 2008. They're not predominantly, they were Democratic cities and they had performed well. And when you start looking at the actual turnout, every one of those cities, males outvoted females. So that's even more interesting because normally it's a 53-47 in those cities. So I just think the gender, you could say it's a factor. It is, but it's probably a correlate. It's probably, I think in her case, a message. It was the baggage from her husband. It was the baggage that I think Trump pointed to, and she simply never had, it prevented her from having a message. There weren't black voters in these cities that had a reason to turn out. Obama was a black candidate, but you could always argue Bill Clinton might have been the first black candidate because he had even higher turnout rates in those cities in the same election. So I just think the message was just never there. And as a result, she couldn't mobilize a base.
And you could argue the way the email controversy was not put to rest. You can go to any place in corporate America or in politics and talk about how do you handle bad news. And one of the best at doing that, I said earlier to some people, was Lloyd Benson. When he had a controversy when his Senate finance chairman, and he had gone to some breakfast with lobbyists and it blew up, and he said, when I make a mistake, it's a butte. And that's the last we'd heard about it. He did it right away, and he ended up as an extraordinary Treasury Secretary and a great man, I thought. But it didn't hurt him because he dealt with it right away.
Yeah.
And we can talk about Facebook or anybody else, but if you're Johnson & Johnson, you deal with poisoned Tylenol and clear the shelves.
Right.
You go on to greatness as a company. And it's the same for candidates. If in March, when the New York Times on March 8th or something broke that story about the emails, if she had come right out and said, yes, it was a mistake, I'm too secretive, it goes back to the 90s, I'm going to be more open, I'm sorry, turn the page.
Yeah.
And instead, we went an entire summer. She did the first interview on Labor Day, September 4th. I know because I did it.
Yeah, I was going to say, you were there for that, weren't you?
I was there for that one. But that was, pulling and tugging to get her to finally sit down for an interview. And
she wouldn't say, I'm sorry, right? Exactly,
and it dogged her. Yeah. She was supposed to, quote unquote, from the pre-brief, but didn't. Yeah. So she had to do another one with ABC to finally say she was sorry. But it was just, it was the cloud over the campaign at every stop in Iowa and New Hampshire all summer.
Can I make one other point, having covered 08 and 12, especially thinking about 2012, that what made this election different? I think Hillary's gender is certainly a factor. Not being an African American, certainly a factor in terms of things that were working against her. But there was something else that Trump did, and let's just be candid about it. I mean, Trump talked in ways that were never seen before in polite conversation in American politics. And to a lot of folks, probably many in this room who have college degrees or advanced degrees, they were horrified by it. They thought, oh my gosh, this is an open racial demagogue who is now a major party nominee. Of course that can't work here in America, because that never works here in America. Well, there was an audience for it, and his language was, I think, to many folks in the sort of political middle, like a bit jarring, but it found a receptive ear to a lot of people who were uneasy with people like Mitt Romney, because they felt like, yeah, it's another one of those rich Republican guys, I don't quite like him, and I can't really relate to him. As Mike Huckabee once said, he looks like the kind of guy that would fire you. About Mitt. And I spent a lot of time in Ohio in September of 2016, and it was extraordinary. I mean, you had Donald Trump, who was basically giving you Sherrod Brown's trade policy. Sherrod Brown's a very populist Democratic senator from Ohio. So Trump gave you Sherrod Brown's trade policies, but at the same time, you could keep your gun, and he was going to, talk about immigrants taking your job. If you're a guy in Youngstown, I mean, that's a pretty good message. So I think that the combination of some of the language he used around race in American life, coupled with his breaking from party orthodoxy on trade, opened up a lane for him across much of the Rust Belt.
Yeah, and I was just not just that that it found a receptive audience, but that it found a receptive audience in exactly the right place.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so I grew up in Metro Detroit, in one of the million little auto towns, and I had friends and family members, and this was, political reporting is always reconciling your gut and your instincts and your own observations with the data, and trying to figure out which you trust more and how you can marry them, if at all. And even as we're seeing the numbers throughout the summer getting worse and worse and worse for Trump, I'm talking to friends and family members back home in Metro Detroit, some of whom had good auto jobs and who had never gone to college and suddenly found themselves waiting tables at Chili's in their late 40s and trying to support their family that way. These folks had never voted Republican in their lives, and they've got Trump signs on their lawns. And then, and that's just back home among people I know with kind of an informal focus group. But like Jonathan said, go to Ohio, and you go to Pennsylvania, you go to Wisconsin, and you're seeing the same thing, and you're thinking, boy, either my own anecdotal observations here are way off, or the polling is way off. Right? It's got to be one of the two, and I think that was a struggle for a lot of us.
And in those so-called blue wall states that fell, it wasn't just Trump, because if you look at what had been happening in those states leading up to 2016, they all had Republican governors. Yeah. Most of them had majority Republican congressional delegations, state legislatures. So something's been going, the soil was prepared, so to speak, for Trump to reap the harvest. I'm going to quit with that analogy, but he was walking, again, I think he was walking through an open door that only he realized wasn't locked.
And Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, that election, the fact that a Republican had won that election, I think Bob Casey in Pennsylvania is different because he's from Scranton, and his father was legendary in the area and a governor, and before that, Auditor General, so that the remaining Democratic senator in Pennsylvania. But Pennsylvania was absolutely open for that.
Yeah.
Bob?
I was going to ask this obvious question. Pennsylvania, particularly Wisconsin, those are red states. I mean, Scott Walker went through how many challenges? I mean, this is a red state. It also gave us Joe McCarthy in Fighting Bob LaFollette, so to say it's schizophrenic, but I'm not altogether certain that I would have been, when I was looking at Mark Franklin's polls, I was looking at the Michigan poll, the Detroit News, I was wondering, maybe the polls were wrong because the fundamentals on the ground were there were Republicans in these elective offices, and there were races that we had seen within 6 to 9 months, particularly in Wisconsin, that would have suggested the Republican organization. I mean, Tammy Baldwin had won an election, but that was almost 5 years before in an Obama sweep. So my question was, like, maybe the polls were premature about maybe where the Democratic base was, but at the end of the day, I think, I wasn't at all surprised to see a closer race. And 21,000 votes in 3 states is, I call counting error.
But all of those Republicans, Snyder in Michigan, Kasich in Ohio, Walker in Wisconsin, they were all elected in off years, right? So
exactly.
it's we can't draw a straight line here. It's
The other thing is the immigration debate and the messaging, build the wall. Whenever a crowd was kind of not rallying as vigorously as he wanted, he would come out with build the wall and who's going to pay for the wall. We now know where that's going. Now it's going to be the military if that really happens. But that was...
Spoiler, no.
I mean, there's more than a dog whistle there.
Yeah, no, that's what I meant. Yeah, I mean,
as you were just alluding to.
I mean, you can't avert your gaze from the kinds of things that he was saying. I mean, we forget it now, but he repeatedly at the end of the campaign going into African American audiences and saying, "What do you have to lose?
What do you have to lose?" That's exactly right.
You guys have been getting shafted for years.
Neighborhoods are hellholes.
And voting Democrats, yeah, you're living in this sort of hellhole. I mean, we had never heard this in modern American politics, and so I think there was an assumption of, that's not going to work. People are going to recoil from that, and in fact, the right voters did, in fact, respond favorably to that. I mean the right voters to what Tim was saying, which is the right parts of the country that he most needed to win.
Mm-hmm. Let me just raise a subject that we don't often discuss when talking about campaigns, and this is the transition. By dint of not expecting to win, and also a certain amount of fear of getting too far down the road, and the firing of Chris Christie, which interrupted the planned transition, this could be the least prepared president-elect to take over. And I think we're reaping he is reaping some of that now, in that he chooses a Secretary of State he did not know, and they just did not click.
Right.
They did not, for a lot of reasons, properly vet the National Security Advisor, the first one, who was a favorite from the campaign trail, lock her up, but had a background that was wholly inappropriate to hold that office, even for 28 days.
It was the worst, I mean, by far, the worst transition of any newly elected president. I mean, Andrew Johnson may have had a worse one, I don't know, but he found out
That's growth, yeah.
like that. But this is somebody who was elected president because he had no experience in the world of government and politics. He didn't know anybody. He's got 4,000 jobs to fill, and there's no names in his Rolodex, and the people around him in his campaign at that stage tended not to know anybody. So he went with, I think Mike Pence, probably the most influential vice president in history during the transition, because by that time I think Pence had credibility with Trump, and Pence does know a lot of people, and the Scott Pruitts and Tom Prices and so on, who ended up in the cabinet, were often people Trump got their name from Pence, but that still left vast areas of the White House staff and of the cabinet and sub-cabinet where Trump just really didn't know where to begin. And beyond not knowing anything, he didn't realize what I think most of us would realize in a situation like that. So who do I talk to? I mean, the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, the Partnership for Public Service, there'd been a massive effort by these groups before the election to come up with all sorts of material for whoever was elected president. Trump had no interest in that at all.
Yeah.
And quickly on the Pence point, I think it's interesting, as we've seen one episode after another with infighting and turmoil in the White House and folks leaking to us constantly, the one name that you never see in the middle of any of it is Pence. And I think that there's a strategic awareness there, and I think it goes back to the transition. When Pence was handed the reins to the transition team, there were any number of allies of his who came to him and said, well, okay, so I'd love a job working for you. And Pence said to almost every single one of them, I don't want you working for me. I need some eyes and ears around this administration, so I'm going to put you here, I'm going to put you here, I'm going to put you there. And I don't want you to be leaking to the press. I want you to report back to me. And it's something that's gone very underappreciated, but Pence has a beat on everything that's happening in this administration in a way that nobody else does. And I think there are implications of that I will not speculate on.
And let me just validate my own personal experience, because correspondence, I've covered the State Department since 1994, and every Secretary of State in different parties, but never once traveled with Rex Tillerson because of his refusal to take a real press corps on the plane. Mm-hmm. I think to his detriment, frankly, because he did not have the experience of working with the press, bringing a press secretary with him, backgrounding, having assistant secretaries in place who could talk to the press about what his goals were in each place he was going. So I traveled commercially, trying to keep up with a military plane for about 4 months, and discovered that didn't work, period. It's impossible to keep up and do a decent job. So we kind of gave up. And I ended up going to the Middle East with Vice President. And he had a very tough brief. He had to go to Jordan and explain the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem to King Abdullah, who chewed him out in public on camera. So it was not an easy trip by any means. It was in the middle of the government shutdown. There were all sorts of issues. But he has such a good staff. And for someone who hadn't been able to travel the way I want to travel, to go around the Middle East and to military bases, and there's a good chief of staff, there's a great press secretary, the vice president makes himself available. He's just a politician. So for all of saying that politicians and campaign operatives and people who've done government work, need to be ashamed of what they do and replaced by somebody new and different and a change agent. There's something to be said for someone who understands governing and the desire to communicate to the American people.
And I think, and we're now drifting from the campaign into the present day, but I think that the political implications and really the implications for the Trump legacy are clear, given what you were talking about at the outset of the administration. He doesn't know Washington. He frankly doesn't understand the government. It's never been part of his life. So he turns over the portfolio of governance effectively to Mike Pence and Reince Priebus.
And Paul Ryan.
And so by virtue, Paul Ryan. What do they all have in common? They are standard issue, down the line, traditional Republicans. They are not Donald Trump. And what happens is basically Donald Trump's first year, besides the chaos and the tweets, he becomes a conventional Republican. And instead of beginning his administration with a massive infrastructure bill, which would have really squeezed, I think, both parties, he starts his administration doing what? Trying to repeal Obamacare. President Trump was never invested in repealing Obamacare. That was never his passion. That's not what he ran on per se, but he was told by the folks around him, who were, again, conventional Republicans, that that's what you had to do. And so at the outset, he basically polarizes Democrats away from him by pursuing the dismantling of the Obama legacy. And you just wonder in hindsight what this president could have been. Yes, if he was more disciplined, but also if he had pursued an agenda at the outset that was less Paul Ryan and more Donald Trump, and what his numbers would be like among Democrats and Republicans today. And I think about this very often because, as you guys know, he is not given to sort of towing the party line. You just take last month, where after the Parkland shooting, he suddenly says at an open press White House meeting with Dianne Feinstein and other Democrats, I'm open to massive gun control, and I think we should actually not do due process on guns. I mean, holy crap, this is remarkable. Just imagine what he would do scrambling the political lines if he actually pursued his instincts and was not restrained. It would make political science a hell of an industry, because he would challenge the realignment in this country's politics. If Donald Trump was pursuing massive gun control, what would the right say and what would the left say? Both would be just uncertain. It would be, remarkable to see.
Well, what we because of the bandwidth that we all have, and because of the velocity with which information and decision-making is happening in Washington right now. What we're not covering as adequately probably are the deregulatory efforts. Interesting, whether you're for them or against them, EPA, the agencies, FDA. There's a whole lot of governing that's going on, and it's all being done, without legislative action because of the stalemates in Congress.
Right.
We're going to have to leave it there. There's a 2020 campaign ahead, and there's a panel that's going to talk about going forward. But I want to thank all of you, Bob Stein, Mike Nelson, Berta, Jonathan Martin.
Thank you.
And thanks to the Baker Institute and to Secretary Baker for inviting us.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
I really enjoyed that.